Hey, what's up guys? My name is Henry. I'm an FXTD currently working at the mill, and today I'm going to be taking you through a general overview of the Houdini software. I get this sort of question a lot, is how do I learn Houdini? And today I wanted to take you through a sort of general overview so you can understand a bit more in context how Houdini works, and then go and find other tutorials and other resources that really fit and tailor your interests. We're going to do some stuff today. Basically, we're going to recreate this scene, or maybe not recreate it pixel for pixel, but we're going to recreate the 3D from this scene. This was a very simple thing that I put together. We're going to model this sort of sound brick here, which is based off a speaker I actually have on my desk. We're going to put some shaders together, we're going to put some lights in there, and we're just going to go over how do I get out the things I want to get out of Houdini. How do I get some AOVs out of there? How do I get some images, and how do I sort of generally set my scene up? There's plenty of resources out there, obviously, and there are going to be plenty of them that are going to go over similar ideas, and there are going to be ones that are more tailored to different disciplines like effects or lighting or motion design or whatnot. I'd really recommend checking out some of the stuff that Side Effects themselves have put out for Houdini. Definitely other courses like the First and Every Applied Houdini series, which I believe is free, as well as whether it be Mixed Training or Entagma or Tokaru.com. There's plenty of resources out there, but I'm going to go over the basic overview and hopefully give you a good understanding of how to approach a scene in Houdini. We're going to be using two resource packs here. One is Backlight from Video Copilot, and really I'm going to be using this for some of these photographic maps, which I think are really excellent. And we're going to be using their where is it? There we go. Sound and Music model pack, which we're only going to use because I wanted to discuss file importing as well, since a lot of people who are new to Houdini don't necessarily know how that works. So let's get started by setting up our scene. So I've got Houdini 18 open here, and I want to set this up in a way that I like to work. It's because Houdini's got a whole bunch of panels, and I just want to sort of rearrange this to make my own workspace. So I'm going to click this little arrow here, and it'll give me my network view, or a lot more space in my network view. And to get my parameters up, I'm just going to hit P on the keyboard. That's a hotkey. And you can see if I pop down a node here, it's going to give me my parameters up here, and I can toggle that on and off with the hotkey P. There we go. But before we do any of that, I want to go ahead and actually create a new project. So we're going to go File, New Project, and we're going to set this up. So let's save this. I'm going to stick this on my desktop. That'll do. Yep, so let's create a folder. Let's call this, what do we want to call this? Basic Workflow. Let's do that. Basic Workflow. Accept, and that's not letting me do that. Okay, let's just grab that. And that's our project path. And the project name. Okay, Basic Workflow. Yeah. Cool. So we want to create some folders here. I'm going to turn most of these off. I'm going to turn off the HDA, Sim, Alembate. We'll keep texture. I'll keep the render one, but I like to call it pick. Just a bit shorter, a bit easier, a bit snappier. Turn that off, 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 turn that off. So we've got texture, pick, geo. That should do. I don't think we're going to need anything else. We might want to create a cache folder, but I doubt we're going to need that. Okay, so hit accept, and we've got our project set up. You can see it's set our, if we go to edit, aliases, and variables, it's set this this $job variable here over into our basic workflow. I really like this. It just gives us a bit more, it gives us sort of ease of access into this folder. So let's go ahead and set what I want to do here. Let's go ahead and save this file as. We'll save it into our job. So we're going to call this Basic Workflow Scene version 1. Okay, that's all right. So how do we get started with this? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at modeling this speaker. So we're going to drop down a geometry node here, and we'll name this speaker. If I could spell, Jesus. Speaker. There we go. Let's dive inside this by double clicking, and I'm going to hit tab, and I'm going to put down a box, and we want to model this at world 0. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to set this to it's alright. I'm sort of looking, eyeballing the speaker on my desk. Thanks. Yeah, that's good. What else do we want to do? We want to go ahead and remove the front and back faces. I'm going to put down a blast node here, and I'm going to select this arrow up here. Make sure I'm in primitive selection mode. I'm going to select select all the way through. I could just click and then shift click to select other faces, but it turns if I drag and click, I can select right the way through. So I'm going to hit enter, and that's going to put these in. So primitive 0 and 2 were the ones that went. You can see if I look at my box again by just turning on this display flag, turn on our primitive numbers, you can see that's primitive 2 and that's primitive 0, and those are the ones that got blasted, and then obviously the primitive numbers changed because we had less primitives. So that's great. I want to come down here, I want to round these edges off, so I'm going to put down a poly bevel, like so. And I'm going to select the edges, so I'm going to make sure I'm in edge selection mode. I'm going to click this arrow and I'm going to select this edge, just left clicking and holding down shift here, hit enter, and it's added those in. That's great. It's like 0.1, it's pretty good. We've got this fillet shape set to round. Let's add more divisions into this, we can see it, and there we go. We've got some nice sort of rounded edges off here, and that's great. Okay, that's a nice sort of size for the speaker. So now I'm going to use my normals to extrude along, so I'm going to put down this poly extrude here, and I'm going to just extrude a bit of distances of it into this thing. This is kind of going the wrong way because I want to make sure that I'm defining my shell by the space of this thing, and this thing you can see is extruding off of that. So I'm going to drop down a reverse, which is by default going to reverse my normals. You can see this sort of pinkish bluish hue on the polygons implies the normals have been reversed. And now if I look at this poly extrude, you can see it's extruding inwards on our shell. So let's go in here. I'm going to output the back. It's very nice. I'm also going to, you see this thing that says front group. I'm going to turn that on. I'm going to type front in here just to make it a shorter name. I don't need to be that long. I can hit L just to organize my nodes, space them out evenly. And if we hit the information here, we can see what we've got. So we've got a whole bunch of points, primitives, vertices, polygons, and we've got a group here called front. And this contains 24 polygons, which all of our inside here. All of the, if I go into primitives, let's actually see that. So all of these in this inside surface. And we're going to use that. So let's go down and put a blast here. And we're going to blast out our front group. And we actually want to keep the front group, so we're going to get rid of everything but it. And we've got this. So that's cool. So we've now got our sort of shell. I guess we should name this. So let's just call this out shell or something like that. These nulls don't do anything. They're just really nice placeholders, so you can sort of identify stuff in the stream later on. I'll show you the sort of the value of that in a bit. So we've got our blast. We have blasted off everything apart from those sort of inside faces, and now we're going to put down a polyfill, like so. And this is disgusting. Let's make it a bit better. We're going to set this to a quadrilateral grid, and you can see it's pretty flat. Occasionally you can have it where it sort of bows out and it doesn't look as good. So I'm going to just, for safety, I'm just going to set that smoothing value a bit higher. In this case it doesn't really need it, but we're going to do that just to be safe. And then I'm going to, forgot to do one more thing, I'm going to put out a patch group. So everything that was created in this node is now under a group called patch. So if we look at this, we've got our front group and our patch group. We can at this point delete the front group. We don't need that anymore. So we just put down a group delete. I'm going to pop it in between these two. Delete the front. And you can see now after our polyfill, we've only got the patch, because that's all we need. We don't need that to be anything else. So that's all great. Let's blast away everything but the patch. So we've got patch and delete non-selected, and there we go. So looking cool. At the moment, these have sort of messed up normals, but I want to actually use them because I'm going to extrude some depth into each of these. So let's go ahead and do that. What do we want to do here? Okay, let's identify each island set of geometry. So I'm going to put down a connectivity node, and I'm going to set this into primitive mode. And what this is going to do is this is going to identify each sort of island of geometry. So the best way I could probably illustrate this, if I put down like a box, and I put down a points from volume, I need to transform this like so, and a copy to points. Points, there we go. So I'll plug that in there, plug that in there. How many points do we get in this? It's too many. Oh, no, that's too much. There we go. We're going to scale the box down. Let's just do it to like a tenth of itself. It should be, yeah, looks like it'll be alright. And then we're going to copy that box onto these points, like so. Okay, cool. So if I put down a connectivity node on this and set it to primitive mode, this is going to create an attribute called class. If we middle mouse over this, you can see you've got a point attribute called class. And this thing's a primitive attribute called class. And this thing is basically going to identify each independent island of geometry. So if I come in here, put down a color, I can say if this, we want it to be primitive type because it's a primitive attribute, do a random from attribute, and then class. My caps lock wasn't on, that would have been far more successful. Class. And if we look at this, each cube has been identified with a different color because it's given a random color based on the value in the attribute. And if we select that, we can come over to our geometry spreadsheet here and see that all of the faces, so 0 to 5, are our first 6 faces of the first box of a class of 0, and then the next 6 will have 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, right the way up to, how many points do we have? Like, so we had 100, class goes up to 124 here, so I assume we have 125 points. We do. That's really helpful. Okay, cool. So, go back to our scene view. We're going to do the same thing here, we just need to split these two pieces out. So if we apply our color, we can see if this worked. And it did. We get a different color per each island of geometry here. So that's all cool, that all works. We can get rid of this thing now. And we want to split this out. So I'm going to put down a split node. And I'm going to say at class equals 0. And I'm going to set this to primitives because it's a primitive attribute. And what do we get? No, equals 0. That's interesting. Why doesn't that want to split? Primitive. Hold on, let me figure it out. I'll be right with you. Okay, I don't know what happened there. I think that was just a viewport bug. This has split it out correctly. So basically we said of this connectivity node, we said, hey, we have some primitives that are going to have a class value of 1 and some are going to have a class value of 0. And we basically wanted to split those out. And I think it was probably I had the wrong thing ticked down or whatnot. But this split is successfully removing the class, anything with a class value of 0 out of this input, or this output rather, and anything with a class value of 1 out of this one. So we're going to use this to our advantage. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to poly extrude this. So we're going to just deal with our sort of front face first. And I'm going to come in here, add something like that. Don't need it to be too mad. I'm going to output it back. And again, I'm going to output our group back. You can see here, we've got a back group. We don't need this patch group anymore, so we could probably, again, put down a group delete. Just keep our scene nice and fresh. And we're going to delete patch after we've removed the patch stuff we don't need. It's still going to work. There you go. So there's our connectivity, and it still splits it out fine. So there's our poly extrude. What I want to do with this is I'm going to scale our back group that we created here, just to try and give it a little bit of a groove into the overall shape. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to hit this drop down here. I'm going to select our back group, and we want to scale this on our y axis. So I'm going to set this. Let's do a really small thing, maybe like 0.99, something like that. You can see, yeah, it's just slightly inset the whole thing. And you can see if I merge this back over, so I'm bring in our out shell, also speaker front. You can see it's just created a nice little inset on this thing here, which is exactly what I wanted. And that's pretty nice. The only other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to subdivide this, just give it a few more divisions to work with, something like that. We should probably do that before the extrude, just because it's going to start warping around our transform there. Okay, cool. This looks pretty nice. let's work with that for now. So that's sort of our front done. Let's do our back. Now on the back of the speaker, the brand name is sort of stenciled into the back of it, which is a really cool look. So I'm going to try and recreate that here. What we're going to do is, again, we're going to take our output here, little patch, and we're going to poly extrude it, like so. And we're just going to give it, again, a tiny bit of distance. We don't want it to be too much. 0.1 should be fine. We're just going to have an object that we can kind of cut out of this. So there's our poly extrude. Let's put an output back down. That's fine. And then we're going to put down a font. And this is where we're going to sort of design our own brand logo here. So, okay, this is, by default, it's got an expression in there that's going to identify the frame number, which is really cool. We'll maybe come back to some of these variables later. For now, we can call this something. I called it sound in the previous one. I don't know. Maybe we'll just call it Houdini. Whatever you want to call it, doesn't really matter. We can also change the font. This font I really like, which is called Agency FB. I'm going to use Agency FB bold in this case, and I think that's kind of cool. So let's extrude some depth into this. Just like so. Oop, trying to keep my scene fairly organized, and I just don't want this value to be any larger or the same than this thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just set this to, I don't know, 0.05, so we'll only go halfway in, and we're going to output a back on that. So if I actually turn the display flag on there we go. And let's orient this so that it actually cuts into this geometry. So I'm going to put down a transform. I'm going to rotate this by 180 degrees, like so, and then I'm just going to move it over. I'm going to go set perspective, set view, top viewport. I'm just going to move this so it kind of cuts in something like that. You can see there's the edge of our reference geometry. This little pink flag here is a reference flag. It's really useful when you want to see what something looks like without having to visualize the whole thing. There you go. So let's put down a Boolean. Now, if you're coming from, say, a Maya background, don't worry, Booleans are fully usable in Houdini. I know in Maya they're a recipe for crashing, but here they're pretty solid. So we're going to plug this into our A input and this into our B input, and the operation by default is set to subtract, so it's going to do subtract A minus B. And you can see here, turn off the handles, it's created that. It's stenciled our geometry into this. We're essentially cut it out, like a sort of cookie cutter style thing. And this is fine. The only thing I have a problem with this is the geometry is pretty horrendous. It's full of n-gons and isn't really great. So we're going to VDB this and use essentially a volume technique to give us this shape with some quads. So how are we going to do this? Let's go ahead and put down a VDB from polygons. Now, VDB is a type of volume, which I'll cover if people want me to in a later video. We're going to put that down here. And, okay, this is maybe a little too low res. Let's convert it first so we can see if it's working. Put down a convert VDB. Plug this into our first input, not our second. And we'll set this to polygons. We can see, okay, this looks pretty good. It's managed to convert everything into quads, which I like. We've got some stepping here. This is because our volume is a little bit too low res, so we can tweak that. The other thing we can tweak is the adaptivity, so we don't necessarily need all this resolution in a flat surface like this. So we can say 0.1, and you can see it's going to try and remove some of those polygons here. I think this is looking fine. We could work with this. I'm going to up our resolution though, so let's put this to 0.01. Going to go by a factor of 10. And it's just cooking, you can see down there. And here we go. And okay, cool. And we've got less stepping. This isn't by any means perfect. We've got smooth fly shaded. Yeah, this is fine. At a certain distances, it's fine. We can go up in resolution as well. Yeah, there we go. You see, it's better. It's not perfect, but it is better. So we'll work with that for now. Let's go back to flat shaded. And let's merge this in with everything else. So let's actually put down some nulls, like I said earlier. We're going to name this sort of our out front, and this will be our out back. Cool. Let's merge this together. And there we go. I think I'm going to just indent that a little bit, or just push it back, just so we've got a bit more of a shape to work with here. Pull that back, like so. That's pretty good. I kind of like this shape here. I think it's just going to allow the light to catch on that surface a little bit, which I think will look cool. Cool. This is really as simple as it gets. I just wanted to put together an object, so let's put this. Let's call this something. Yeah, I just wanted to put together an object that was really kind of hopefully very simple to understand and will give you an idea of how some of this stuff can work. We're going to call this out. I'll call it speaker for now. It's not really a speaker, is it? But let's work with it. And the great thing about this is we can see every operation that we've done. So unlike other softwares that rely on things like history and other methods of kind of storing that information, we can literally go through the nodes. We created a box, we blew out a couple of the sides, we rounded those edges off, we extruded it inwards, again we selected just those front faces, filled it in and blasted out everything that wasn't those patches. We split each patch out, we made a bit of an extruded front here and with a bit of an inset on that transform, and then same here, we booleaned a front-facing or the backwards-facing panel here, so we had our text in there. We VDB'd it and converted it back into polygons. We ended up with something that was a much nicer mesh to work with, and then we merged them all together. And we can see that it's a very obvious tree to go through. And the great thing about this is that this is to some degree procedural. So I can come in here and I can say, hey, I want this box to be taller now. Let's make it like 50% taller. It's 1.5. And it's going to cook its way through everything. See, that VDB is really taking up the most time here. But in a second, there you go. We've now got a taller speaker, or a taller brick, or whatever you want to call this, bar of soap. It's a very cool system to work with, and it just allows you to really see each process and come in and amend stuff as you need to. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to drop this back down to 1. I kind of like that. And the last thing I'm going to show you before we move on to the next section is how to just move this up onto the ground plane. We're not going to do it with just a standard transform, where the node will be transformed, but we're going to do it with an expression, which I kind of like. So I've shown you this a couple of times, or clicked on it a couple of times, this information panel, which if you, I'll show you how I'm doing that. You can either hover over your any node and hit this information here, or you can straight up middle click and hold on that and it'll give you that. If you do it on this, it gives it like a floating panel. We can see how many points and primitives and vertices we've got. We can see what attributes we've got and what our primitive attributes and whatnot are. I might clean some of these up because they're a little bit, we don't need any of these anymore really. But we've also got these, and these are implicit values within our model. It's things like where's the exact center of this model, or where is the min and max bounds in X, Y, and Z on this, or what's the size? We can take advantage of some of that information and use it. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to put in an expression so that we look at the bounding box and move this up to the ground plane. So it's currently at world 0, and we want to change that. So let's, in our transform, we'll transform it in Y. So to do it, we just put in a value of 0.5, and it would go up to the ground plane, right? Because this this maximum, what am I talking about? The size in Y is 1, and in order to move this up, because we know this is equal on either side, we're going to move it up by 1. I want to do that with an expression in case we change it. So I'm going to say, hey, let's put it down a B box, and then we're going to look within this node for our out speaker, which is this null here, and say, hey, tell me that. Tell me what the size in Y is for that. So I'm going to put in D underscore Y size in all caps, close off that bracket, and okay, so this has given me the Y size, which was 1. We don't want to move it up by 1, so I'm just going to come in here and tell it, hey, do that expression and then divide it by 2. and that's just going to stick it on the ground plane. Let's say we can name this as such. So put on ground plane. There we go. Okay, cool. So that's our modeling section. Let's move on to laying this thing out. So we'll dive back up to our object level, and I'm going to throw down another geometry node, and I'm going to call this our ground. And this is going to be really simple. We're going to create a grid, like so. If we want to still see that speaker, by the way, we can come up to this icon over here and set this to show all objects, just so we can keep that in mind where that's sitting. We're going to select that, and we're going to say, let's make this like a 20 by 20 grid. We don't need any subdivisions on this. We set this to 2 by 2. It turns to flat wire shaded. And what else do we need? We're going to need some UVs, so I'm going to use a UV texture node. And by default, this is going to work fine. We're going to do an orthographic projection in the y-axis, and we can put down a UV quick shade to just test whether our UVs are working. UVs are a vertex attribute, so they should appear here, which they do. And so that's great. UV quick shade, and everything seems to be working. We can come over here from change our viewport to the UV viewport. Okay, we repair it. I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about that. We're back. Houdini's thankfully got a pretty good temp saving system, so we can use that if ever we get a crash. So what we're doing, we're going to look at our UVs. So we can come over here by hitting this perspective camera view. We're going to set this to a UV viewport. This is kind of hard to see because we've just UV'd a grid, but if we put down maybe, I don't know, a pig head and display that, you can see this is how we would view our UVs in Houdini. It's sort of tied into the viewport here. So all of our UVs are working great. We're going to put down a null. I'm going to call this outground. Cool. Okay. So what do we want to do next? Well, I'm going to show you a little bit of texture generation in Houdini. I kind of ummed and ahed about how I was going to do this and whether I was going to do it at all, and if I was going to do it, what we were going to do. But I figured I might as well show you because it's kind of cool if you can do it. So let's come in here. I'm going to put down texture gen. So we've got a geometry node here. Dive inside, and I'll put down an object merge. And I'm going to hit this icon here. And this is where those nulls we've been creating really come in handy, because you can see at the top of every geometry node, they're there. They're really easy to access, and it sort of makes organizing your scene a lot better. I'm going to select this outground here, and if I turn off, I'll set hide other objects here. You can see that's come through into this geometry node. And now I'm going to basically try and create little islands of geometry. So how are we going to do this? Well, I'm going to create a Voronoi fracture, which you may or may not be familiar with. A Voronoi fracture is basically a way of creating islands of geometry. It looks at a bunch of points and it says, hey, what are you closest to? This area of geometry, which point are you closest to? And I can kind of describe this way. Just give me a second, I'm going to put down 3 transforms, merge them together. Don't want to select that. Grab those 3 transforms, merge those together. So we've got 3 points. Actually move some of these in different directions so we can see something. Select one like that. One can go over here, and one of them, that one, can go over here. So we're going to use this Voronoi fracture node. So we're going to, if you hover your mouse over the inputs, you can see either on the inputs or at the bottom of the network view what actually it requires. So we're going to plug in our geometry to fracture into this input, and our points for Voronoi cells into this one. And you can see it split the geometry into 3 separate islands, and we can see that if I put down an exploded view here. Typically we'd use this for destruction sims and a whole bunch of other things. In this case we're going to be using it to generate sort of puddles on the ground. So this is kind of interesting. You can see if I move these points around, the actual cells are going to move themselves. So we can create some really weird and interesting patterns this way. We're not going to do this viewpoints. We're going to create something a bit different. So let's go ahead and do that. We want to create a new set of points. And we don't just want 3. We want lots. So I'm going to put down a scatter node. plug that in here. It's going to create 1,000 points by default. It's probably too many. What I kind of settled on in my original scene was I put down a bare minimum number of points in here. I'm going to turn off this relax iterations thing, by the way, because I don't want them to be too uniform in their spacing. And then I'm going to put down a point replicate, like so. And this is going to replicate a whole bunch of points in here. I don't need 100, so I'm going to go with like 25. You can change the shape to maybe a sphere. We'll add some noise onto this, maybe something a bit more aggressive like that, and then plug that into our Voronoi fracture. And so this, turn those off, this is going to give us a much more interesting look. It's going to give us lots of cells of different sizes and shapes, and we can use this to generate some interesting looking puddles. Let's just take L to organize the nodes. Put that up here. It's better. And we can play on the scatter node. We can play with our global seed. Let's try and move this around so we get something we kind of like. We can increase our number of points. Maybe make this like 7 or 8. So obviously it's going to get more expensive the more points we add. Something like this looks okay. Maybe we can, yeah. I think this feels alright. Let's go with something like that for now. And this is pretty much all we're going to need to do. You can obviously come in and generate a million different patterns. Houdini is sort of well known for being able to do really complicated patterns that you just couldn't really model by hand. But in this case, we're just going to use something simple like this. So let's just, for now, I'm going to turn the display flags off on my speaker and ground. I'm going to set some cameras up for our texture. So I'm going to put down a camera node. I'm going to try and keep these all together and then sort of have a main cluster of nodes for the overall scene. I'm going to call this texture cam, and I'm going to move it up. So let's look at our handles here. Select texture cam. What do we want to do here? Let's move this up by say 15, and we want to rotate it in its x-axis. Which way is that? Okay, let's do a whole number or a positive number. Let's do 270. So that's going to be, you can see, pointing downwards now. Let's look through it. So we go click on this no cam thing here, hit texture cam. Okay, this is kind of doing what we want. I'm going to set the resolution of this camera to be 2048 by 2048, which is a 2K map. That's pretty good. Let's zoom all the way out so we can see our pattern. We don't want to go off the edge too much. Something like that should be pretty good. And there we go. So we've got our pattern, and we need to put this into our shader somehow. We're going to first have to render it though. So I'm going to come down from this object level. I'm going to come to the output level, and we're going to put down a mantra node. And mantra is basically the renderer that comes free with Houdini. You will have heard of Solaris, which will contain Karma, which is going to be SideFX's GPU node, or GPU-based renderer, I should say, which will kind of replace mantra. So mantra support is going to end, but mantra will always be, I believe, included in Houdini, at least for some time. So let's set a few things up. We're going to tell it we want to render from our texture camera. We're going to come to the objects, and we're going to force it to render just our texture generation thing, which is this. That's all good. We want to output it somewhere. So remember, we set that job variable up that points to our file structure. I want to use that here. So I'm going to say $job, and then I want it to go into our, do we have a texture folder? I think we did. We have a text folder, and I'm going to call this texture 01.txr. And that's really all we need to do. The other thing I'm going to do here is I just want to make sure that this has a consistent color that we can use. So I'm going to come over to, I'm going to hit plus over here. I've got to remember where this is actually stored now. There it is, material palette. We're just going to come over here, and there's a nice constant material that we can use. We're just going to drag and drop this into here, and that will create a material in our material network over here. I should probably set this up now since you know, I'm going to be doing it later anyway. I like to have all my materials up on the object level, so I'm going to copy this and just delete it from here, and I'm going to put down in our object level a material network. and let's call this materials, dive inside, and I put down our constant in here, and this has created the exact same thing as this. It's just, to my mind, this makes more sense. It's sort of here, and I can come and access it a lot easier than having to jump into another context. So we've got that. I'm just going to, on our texture gen thing here, I'm going to set the material under the render tab to look at that constant material, like so. Cool, and I think that's pretty much everything we need in our output here. I'm just going to call this render texture. Texture is spelled with one T. Always do that. And if we come over to our render view here, we can go ahead and hit render and see what we get. Hopefully, we'll get a nice black and white map, and there we do. Yeah, that's pretty good. And that's pretty much all we're going to need to go ahead and make our wet floor texture. So let's, we've got that all set up here, so make sure that's going to the right place. So basic workflow, text, texture, perfect, exactly what I wanted. To do that, I was just middle mouse clicking on this, and it was resolving that variable here. So I'm just going to say render to disk. Got an error. Headlight was automatically added. That's fine. It's because we had no lights in the scene. We didn't need any anyway. So that's cool. What are we going to do now? Well, we should probably lay out our scene. So I'm going to come out of this texture camera here, and I'm going to just hide both of these by turning their display flags off. We don't need to see those anymore. So we've got our speaker, turn that back on, we've got our ground, and we want to probably set a small scene up here. And this is where I want to very briefly discuss file importing. So let's create another geometry node, and I'm going to just sort of name this, which we call this scene or set, something like that. I'm going to import everything I want in here, but I want to basically just go over this. We're going to be importing .obj file types. So we're going to be using a regular file node. If you have an alembic file type, which is pretty common, you want to be using the alembic node to bring that in. But in this case, we're just going to be using a file. So I'm going to come in here, and I believe I stuck these on my desktop. Sorry, my very messy desktop here. What do we want to use here? They had a nice thing I used in mine, which was an XLR cable, so I'm going to pull that in. And it's going to do its thing. There we go. Now, a thing to note, I don't actually know what these were modeled in. I would assume for Video Copilot they were modeled in 3ds Max. What's worth noting is that files that were created in Maya or Max need to be scaled back quite a bit. You can see this is 125 or more than 125 meters long, and obviously that's not accurate. Houdini works in meters as a grid unit, and Maya works in decimeters as a unit. So we need to scale this back a fair bit. So usually the first thing I do is when you import a file, I'm going to say scale to Houdini, and we'll just set this to 0.1. There we go. And we might need to scale it some more and fiddle with it. I don't know whether these were modeled in modeled kind of in real world units, but certainly we're going to need to scale that back. So I'm going to turn on show all objects. Yeah, we're going to need to scale this back again. Let's do it to what? 0.01. That's way too small. 0.05 again. That probably looks okay. Yeah, let's go with that. So we've got our model imported here. Again, I'm going to object merge in our ground plane. You can see again how useful those nodes are. Oh, ground. There we go. So we've got that, and I'm going to scatter some points over this thing. And like I showed you with the boxes earlier, I just want to put a whole bunch of these around the scene. So we're going to put down a copy to points, like so. And that's going to copy a whole bunch of these models onto these points. Now, I want to randomize their orientation a little bit. So I'm going to need two things for that. I'm going to need a normal vector, and I'm going to need an up vector. And the normal is going to define which direction it should point in, and up is going to tell it what axis to align on. So we're going to do that real quick here. We're going to create an attribute randomize, and I'm going to set this to n, and already it's giving me something. I'm going to set this to a directional orientation, and this is sort of randomly set this. I'm like, okay, this is kind of cool. And then I'm going to put down an attribute wrangle. Now, I like writing stuff in Vex code, and this is maybe where we're going to get to our sort of most technical, point in this demo. You don't have to use attribute wrangles. You can create attributes with things like an attribute create. But I'm going to do this in code here, and I'll try and explain what I'm doing. And I really recommend learning this, especially if you want to become a real Houdini TD. So let's set a couple of things up. Let's say we want a vector type, and we're going to call that thing up, and we're going to set that to be 0, 1, 0. So it's always pointing up in y, like so. And then I'm going to say of our normals, which we've already generated, I want to make these all kind of flat. So I'm going to say at n dot y equals 0. Hopefully, yeah, there we go. That's just going to flatten them all down. So we can now change these points around. Maybe we want less of them, so they don't overlap as much. Something like this. Kind of feels okay. We can transform this around as well, just so that they're a little less obvious. No, it's going up. Something like that for now. I think it's alright. We might need to, yeah, we're going to need to move these above the ground plane as well. Something like that. Pretty good. Okay, cool. Let's work with that. We're going to have to adjust some camera clips and stuff like that. So we've got those kind of scattered everywhere. We're just going to call this, put down a null, say out XLR, or XLRs, pluralize it. So that's fine. This just gives us some additional models, and I just wanted to cover importing models into Houdini and what your file types were. If you've got models of your own, definitely try importing them. Definitely just get used to that process, because it's really worth it. So let's lay this out somehow. Let's go ahead and create another camera. I'm not going to put down a camera at world 0 this time. I'm going to use the shelf up here, and I'm going to control click on the camera, and it's going to create a camera from that view, which is pretty helpful. So let's go ahead and rename this. I'm going to call this shot cam, like so. One of the things I like to do is I like to put a null above this and parent the camera to a null, and just say this is like cam control. It just means if I want to scale it or rotate it, it's easier to sort of, to my mind at least, to plug animations into this rather than into this. So let's look through our shot cam here. I'm going to select this this padlock icon here. We can just come in and zoom in on our scene, like so. Just going to try and make something I think feels kind of nice. I definitely want to adjust my near clip, set this to 0, 1, and I'm going to zoom in, something like that. I'm going to set my resolution. I want to use something like 1920 by 818. The reason I'm doing this, I could do 1920 by 1080. 1080. That would be a 16 by 9 crop. I'm using 818 because that's a 235, and I personally want to use a 235. It's the only reason I'm using that resolution. So we've got our XLR cables laid out on the ground. We've got our speaker here. We need to now look at lighting this, and then we need to set some shaders up for everything. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, as I said earlier, we're going to be using Video Copilot's backlight collection just to get some textures on our actual lights. You don't have to use this. There's by no means an obligation. I just thought it looked kind of cool, and I wanted to show you how I did that. But again, we're going to come out here. We're going to make sure we've unticked that padlock, and we're going to come out here and we're going to start placing some lights. Now, the temptation is to put down an environment light and use that first. I'm not a huge fan of that. I like to get sort of the basic shapes out and then go for the environment light if I feel it needs it. So the first thing that was really kind of distinct in my original render was this sense of a light shining on a wet floor. We could really see that bright light here. So I'm going to try and replicate that. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to put down an area light here by control clicking on the area light icon up here. You can see it's adjusted the exposure so that we're actually going to see it hit the object in front of us. Let's go over to shot cam. Okay, this is kind of already doing what we expect in the viewport. I'm going to move that over here. So it's with our main scene stuff. And I'm going to rename this with a prefix, LGT underscore area 01. That's our first light. And let's go and set up our mantra ROP, in this case, for our main render. So let's say this is our scene. We're going to set up the output picture to $job. In this case, I want it to go to our pic folder where all our renders are going to go. I'm going to say $hip name, like that, because I want to know what the file it was that came from. And this will create like a subfolder within that. And then I'm going to say $OS, which is the name of the node, and then $F4, so the frame number with a pad of 4, .dxl. And if we resolve this, we can see this will have created in our job in pic folder. It's given the name of the hip, and then scene, and then the frame number. We're on 1 at the moment. So that's great. We're going to select our shot camera over here, like so, and we're going to come over to our objects. We want to go into force objects, and we want to say, hey, I'm going to render the ground and the speaker and the set, except pattern. And then under the force lights, I want to say render anything with the prefix LGT, and it'll go in and it'll look for that thing in our viewport. Our network view here. Any light that has LGT, if it doesn't have LGT underscore as a prefix, it's not going to render it, or not going to consider it for the render. So that's pretty good. Let's see what we get in our render view. So we're going to change this to be our app scene rather than our render texture. Let's see what we get. There we go. Now it's going to do a preview render here. Okay, so this is fine for now. We can set it to a full res or full fidelity render by just ticking this off. You can see it's coming in. It's actually rendering the final quality pixel, or at least the final quality that we've got set in our ROP. Okay, so this isn't obviously great. We need to set a material on this thing to actually get the surface to be considered properly. So let's do that. We're going to come into our materials, and I'm going to put down a principled shader, like so. I'm going to name this something. Let's name this, I don't know, props. So we'll give this to our speaker and our XLR cables. I'm not going to worry about plugging in any textures yet. We'll do one for the one that we created, but we're not going to worry about that at the moment. And then we'll create another one of these. I'm just going to Control-C, Control-V to copy it and paste it. And I'm going to call this one ground. Okay, cool. So let's plug those in. We're going to say to the ground, we want you to render using the ground material here. And for both, we can select both. The speaker and the set, we want them to render with the props shader. And we can see if I come into each of those, they've been set up for us. If you want to experiment with more material types and building materials, in the material palette there's a nice selection to choose from. They're not all necessarily perfect, but you can definitely take these and play around with them if you'd like to do that. So we've got those set up. Let's re-render this. And in fact, before that re-renders, I'm going to hit this little camera icon down here, and that's just going to save an image that we had before. So hopefully we can see a bit of a before and after of what we've got here. Just give that a second. Okay, so something's definitely changed here. Let that do its thing. So what Houdini was doing before, it was sort of creating a bit of a pseudo material and saying, hey, just draw the pixels of the geometry that we have. Now that we've set an actual shader onto these, it's going to consider things like specular, roughness, color, everything else that we set on that. So you can see there is a noticeable difference between these two types. And in this one, we're going to have a lot more control. So let's play around with a few things. I'm going to go inside our material network, and I'm going to set this up for the props. I don't want them to be super shiny, so I'm going to set the IOR down to, or the index of refraction down to 1.1. Set the roughness 0.6, something like that. See what we get. I'm going to turn on this preview again because I kind of want them to just go through that quite quickly. I don't need a final quality thing yet. So where we go? Here we are. Come on. Okay, that's nice. You can see we're going to need to light this a lot better. Let's play around with our base color. I want this to be fairly dark, so we'll go ahead and do that. You can see if I made this sort of a bright red, we'd see that come through here. Just make it a bright red. We might even want this to be even rougher, so let's maybe make this, I don't know, 9. Okay, it feels a bit nicer. Cool. And actually with our ground, I'm going to set the index of refraction for now just to 1, so it's not at all reflective. I just want to kind of see how the lights are behaving. And let's make this just white for now. There we go. So we've got our first light, and let's actually colour this so it's a bit more obvious. I'm going to make this kind of nice and orangey, so something like that. And again, we'll hit render, just see how that's coming through. Okay, so that's obviously very, very strong and very orangey. We want to kind of counter this with something a bit cooler coming in this direction. So I'm going to duplicate this light, like so. I'm going to click on our perspective view here. So I'm going to look through the camera view. I'm going to say look through light. Set this to area 02, and I can hit the lock, and I can move this around our scene. Say, hey, you're going to now be rendering from maybe here, something like that. Set this back to our shot cam, and I'm going to come into the color, and I'm going to just adjust the temperature the other way so it's a bit bluer. Maybe something like that. Shift the hue around a bit. That's kind of nice. Let's see how that renders. Okay. Okay, so that's very bright as well. But this gives us a good idea of, sort of how we can bring some of the shapes out. Now it's very obvious where this, what this says, as opposed to before we really struggled to see that. So let's. I'm going to drop the exposure on this. I don't think this needs to be nearly as bright as it thinks it does. I'm going to do the same on our area, like 1 over here. So let's do maybe 3. Okay, that's already looking a bit nicer. We want this to be a bit higher. Something like that. Okay. That's kind of giving us what we want. I'm going to drop down an environment light. And if you come to your environment map over here, and then select your $HFS variable, you'll actually find you've got a whole bunch of HDRIs that are kind of there by default. I've actually added Video Copilot's backlight and basic collections into here as well, and you can definitely come in and add your own HDRIs that you want to use more commonly, as opposed to having to build a whole HDRI browser. In this case, I'm just going to pick an HDRI that I think is kind of nice. You can add one in from a different file if you want to, but I've got some presets already stored in here, so I'm going to use those. That's kind of cool. Maybe we want to use, let's use that. Let's start with that, and maybe we can play around with something else in the future. Now, I've got to remember to set the LGT prefix on this, so LGT-env. The reason I'm doing that is just sometimes you're going to want to have different lights that affect different things. So if we want to do that, we want to have different prefixes. Set that to 0.1, bit more, 0.2. We'll use that for now. Let's rotate this around 180 degrees. Okay, I think this is alright for now. Okay, so let's start playing around with our ground material. We generated this texture before, and I want to make sure we're using it. So let's put down a texture node here, and we're going to go and find in our job text, and there's our texture here, and we're going to plug this in to the roughness value of our specular. I'm going to set the roughness of the IOR back to 1.5 and hit render. Let's see what we get. Come on. I have a fairly slow computer in case this wasn't obvious. Okay, so now you can see this pattern is coming through on our floor, and it's coming through, I think, fairly successfully. We're getting some areas where it's really shiny and some areas where it's really not. And that's great. That's kind of what we want, except for a couple of things. We are going to want to make some changes to this. But I think that's been fairly successful so far. So it's important to understand what this is actually doing. This is outputting a vector here, and because this is only accepting a single float value, it's basically pulling one channel out of this. It's pulling the R channel. Now, I'm going to actually change this so it outputs an RGBA. It's outputting a 4 float vector value, and I want to actually be able to separate those out. So I'm going to say vector 4 to float, and plug that in here, and you can see we've got 4 channels that come out of this, RGBA. And I want to use our alpha because this kind of, to my mind, is the purest. There's not really a lot of difference between them, but if we went in and re-rendered this, changed the color or something else, it would just give us a bit more grief to come in and change this again. So I want to use the alpha to drive this. It's also important to note that this is giving us values between 0 and 1, as alphas are prone to do. What we want to do with this is we want to be able to map those values differently, because what this is basically saying is if the alpha equals 1, the roughness equals 1. If the alpha equals 0, the roughness equals 0. And I don't always want it to be quite so harsh. You can see these are very, very big differences between the two, and I don't think it would really behave like that. So I'm going to put down a fit range node, and I'm going to plug the output of our alpha into the value, and I'm going to plug the roughness into, or the shift into the roughness. And this is basically accepting 0 and 1 as the source min-max, so we don't need to change that. But now I can say, hey, the destination, the minimum the roughness can be is 0.25, and the maximum it can be, I would say maybe 0.6. So how does this compare? If we hit the snap here, so we've got our old one. What's this actually doing? Well, you can see now there's still a difference, but that difference isn't nearly as big. That difference is actually quite a bit smaller, and I think this makes a huge difference to our overall look. Well, of course it does. You can see here how contrasty those are and how not contrasty these are. So we might want to say, hey, the roughness, maybe we don't want it to go that high, so maybe it would be 0.1, 0.35 would be good starting place. Maybe we'll clamp them back a bit more. We could even invert this, so we could say, hey, the source min is actually 1 and the source max is 0, and this will flip them, like so. There we are. So that's kind of cool. We've generated a texture inside of Houdini, brought that in, and are now using it to drive something on a shader. It's not particularly uncommon for CG, but it's certainly cool that we can do that all within Houdini. Now, one thing I want to do, these are very, very sharp shapes, and I want to break this up because this feels not very puddly to me. So what is worth understanding is this is basically looking at our UV value, and it's saying, okay, I need to project that texture onto this geometry based on the UV coordinates. And we've got this exposed here. While by default, it's picking up whatever the UVs are on the geometry, we can bring those UVs in manually and start to play with them before the texture ever picks them up. That's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to put down a bind node. I'm going to bind in UV, which I know is a vector type, like so. It's got an X and Y component. It'll ignore the Z component. And I want to add some noise to it. I want to kind of break it up. So I'm going to put down an add like so, and an anti-aliased noise. I'm going to plug our anti-alias noise into the UV here, so it's generated based on where the UVs are. And then I'm going to make sure this outputs a 3D noise, and I'm going to plug that into our add. And now we can plug this into our UV and watch what happens to the texture. Snap this, generate again. Let that do its thing. Almost there. Okay, so immediately you can see it's really started to break this up. These edges aren't smooth anymore or straight. They're very broken up and they're very jaggedy and different. And I like this. I want to be able to do some really cool noise patterns to kind of describe this surface. I'm going to set this to preview mode again. And you can see it almost looks like oil slick across the surface. This is far, far different from what we initially output. So let's make some changes to this. I'm going to right click on the X component of our frequency and the noise here. I'm going to hit right click, copy parameter, and I'm going to paste a relative reference into the other two channels because I want this to just always look up the first one. I don't want this to stretch it at all. So let's maybe make this 20. How does this look? Okay, wow, we've really got this broken up. And it really looks very, very different. I don't want it to be maybe that great, so I'm going to pull the amplitude back to 0.1. Okay, this is okay, maybe 2.5. You've got to really play around with the values here to get it to work. But you can see now we've got this really nice surface, and you can kind of see what that light's going to be doing now. It's going to be reflecting in this area here and just giving us a nice golden streak across the surface, which I quite like. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to up the octaves of noise to something like 10, just so there's more detail in the noise as we go further down. We can come back and play with this at some point, but certainly I want to play with it now. So that's nice. Let's come back up here. I want this to be a bit more intense, so let's make this maybe 10 times more intense. Okay, wow, that's doing a lot. Just drop the exposure a tiny bit. Yeah, a bit more. 4. That's kind of nice. Okay. What else do we want to do? We probably want to make a third area light. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to Control C, Control V, and we've got area light 3 with that prefix that we need. Let's come out into our scene. I'm just going to hit save so I don't get in case I get another crash. We're going to go to LGT area 03, and this is a blue light. We can change that if we want to. And where are you? So there's our Houdini thing here. I'm just going to kind of light this from on top. Try and catch some of those edge shapes that we made. Something like this. Go into our shop cam, render view, let's render, see what difference this made. Hopefully nothing too horrendous. Here we go. Come on. Okay, maybe we want to be a bit more aggressive with this light. 10 times as strong. Okay, that's really blue. Drop the exposure a bit. Okay, this is a bit nicer. I don't even know if we need our environment, to be honest. Let's delete that. What does that look like? Yeah, that looks a lot stronger. I prefer that. Let's work with that for now. We'll always come back to it, right? So what else do we want to do? Well, we've set up our ground shader. I think we probably need to make a few more adjustments to this before we can call it done. Let's darken this down quite a bit. I don't want this to be... There we go. That feels nicer. We'll probably knock back some of these values as well. Maybe we set it to like... Maybe this can be 0. We'll say maybe this is 0.4. Is that too contrasty? 2. Maybe make this 0.05. It's really going to be some fine tweaking that we're going to have to do to get this to look as we want it. Yeah, too much. So that's alright. Let's work with that. Should probably work on our prop shader because that's probably the biggest letdown in the scene at the moment. Let's do much the same we did here. Let's do this system as well. Now it's worth noting this doesn't actually have any UVs, so we're going to need to find a different way of generating that noise. I'm going to put down some global variables here, which we can sort of use to describe the surface much easier. And one of them is well positioned, so I'm just going to use well positioned to drive this. And our add node, anti-alias noise. Plug this in over here. 3D noise, and we're going to do our same trick here. We're going to paste relative references. Let's make this straight out of the box more aggressive, and let's maybe have that drive another noise. That could be kind of nice. So let's grab an anti-alias noise. Plug this in here, and let's do our copy parameter, paste relative reference. I'm going to make this like, I don't know, 30, something really aggressive, and then I'm going to put down another bit range. That's worth noting that anti-alias noise returns a value of between -1 and 1, so we want to make sure that we're outputting between -1 and 1. We only need this to be a float because I'm going to inform our roughness channel with this. So we're going to just say, hey, we want this to go from between -1 and 1 to between 0 and 1, because we don't want our roughness to be -0 or below 0. So we're going to plug that into our roughness here, and let's see what result that gives us. Now what I'm hoping to see is that that's going to sort of break the light up over the surface, so we don't get these really smooth and clean surfaces. Let's just see what it gives us. Okay, so that seems to have helped. It's definitely broken that surface up. Turn this off. It's definitely broken that surface up. It doesn't seem nearly as clean as it has previously. It feels a little bit more dirty. We could be more aggressive with this. Let's try that. Let's just manipulate our base color a little bit. What color do we want this? Let's make them all slightly orangey. Something like that. And I want to tweak this area light. I want this maybe to come from above a bit more. So let's go and look through LGT area light 3. Something like that. Maybe this should come from behind, maybe. Something a little bit more like this. Maybe throw a shot camera, the render cam. How does this look? Yeah, that's a lot stronger. I prefer that. We still see what's going on here, but we've just got a much stronger set of light, so we can see this is really, you can definitely see it here. It's kind of scratched up that surface, which I quite like. Okay. So that's kind of nice. Let's have a look at adding a texture onto one of these lights. So our area light here is pretty nice. This one is, where's this actually located? It's pretty high up. I'm going to actually change where that one's coming from. But the first thing I want to do is I'm going to add a texture to this. So I've actually got in my HFS files, I've added another section called LGT, which contains all of those Video Copilot backlight textures. I'm going to just come in here and select a light texture. Now, if you don't have this particular pack or you don't have a set of textures like this, you can either Google them, or you don't really have to use this. You can either generate your own textures, you can find some creative way to get these images, or you don't have to use them at all. It really doesn't matter, to be honest. I think it's a nice addition to the render, but that's kind of for you to decide on. So we've got that. That's pretty nice. I'm going to set this to maybe 2 by 2, so it's a bit bigger. And I want to, how do I want to do this? Well, let's divide this up so it's a bit easier to access everything. I'm going to click this little drop down here. I'm going to split the panes top and bottom, and I'm going to create a render view over here. I'm just going to set this to scene render. Go. Just throw a shot cam here, and then I'm going to split this top one again, left right, and I'm going to have this one be sort of my perspective viewport, and I'm going to have this right one, or sorry, this left one, be what my shot cam sees. So you can see already this has actually made a really nice difference to our renders. That light's massively broken up compared to just a solid flat light, and I want to pull this around to kind of see what we can do to show off those lights a bit better. So where they are here, let's move this ever so closer. That's kind of nice. We can see them in action a bit more. And you can see already what a massive difference this has made. This is why I like using these. They are a little bit more expensive than traditional lights without a texture, but I just think they make such a nice difference in some cases like this, so that's why I like using them. Okay. So now might be a good time to discuss AOVs, because what I want to do is I want to be able to split out my AOVs to see what these lights are actually doing. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to come over to my app network, or my ROPNet, and I'm going to select the scene. I'm going to come down here, and under extra image planes we can start turning on some of the preset ones and some others that we can use to write out variables and things that we can then manipulate in comp. So the first thing I want is depth. I'm going to turn that on, and it's going to add that in. I don't really want any of these. These per component things are going to look at the diffuse, reflection, coat refraction, and so on. You can turn these on for direct and indirect or combined if you want to use that. I'm not going to do it that way at the moment. I'm going to use a per light set combined lighting here. So I just hit this little plus, and then in the drop down I went to combined lighting per light, and you can type in all yourself and then export variable for each light that way if you want to. But you can see here, if I just get as much of this rendered as possible, maybe we'll put it in preview mode again. So I've got this. I can now come in this drop down, and I can see all of my AOVs. My depth, there's our light 1, which is looking really nice. Light 2, that probably needs some work. Light 3, that's looking fairly nice. I don't think we need to do too much to that. But light 2, I think we definitely need to. This looks a bit too flat. Light 1's looking really nice. I love the golden stuff. You can see the once we glow this, it's going to really just pop in our image. And depth, obviously, we can use to do all sorts of cool effects. Let's see what we can do with our light area 2, because that was the one that really needed the most work, I feel. Let's look at just that. I'm going to try using that texture map method. I want to use maybe some bars. I think that could be kind of nice, as opposed to these round lights. So let's see what we've got here. These are the single lights. See what we can use. These might be kind of nice to look at. Single lights. Yeah, let's use that. So how does this look? We're going to need to boost this quite a bit before we see anything. But is this now really helping? That's definitely too far. Maybe 10 there, 6 there. No, too much again. Just want something kind of soft. Maybe we want to play with the color values of these. Saturate it a bit more. Maybe darken it down. Maybe we can adjust our color temperature, bring it a bit more towards these other values. It's going to be too orange. Let's go ahead, just keep it in the blues. Just a not so bright blue. This is looking better. Yeah, this is looking marginally better. Okay. Cool. Okay, getting happier with this. It's looking nice. And like I said, we don't even have an environment in here. I don't think you always need one. It's potentially sometimes something you want to do, but I'm not super, you know, I don't think it's entirely necessary. Let's see, that one. Let's do that. Let's do that. We might want to tweak this actually, just slightly knock it back some. 3. I want this to be like just an edge light, so it really catches everything, so I don't want it to be too much. That's probably enough. Same with 2. We could probably knock 2 back, let's be honest. 2. Let's add a little something into the scene. Okay, that's kind of cool. Let's boost 3 again. Maybe make the intensity 3. Okay, so this is starting to look nice. I might turn the previews off and actually go ahead and render this, because we do want to try and get an image. You can see this is kind of grainy. I'm going to up our rendering samples and go ahead and render this. So let's go into our output over here, into our scene, and let's go to rendering, and we're going to change our pixel samples up quite a bit. Let's make them 10 by 10. You can see this is going to get really, really expensive really quickly. My little computer's going to struggle with it, that's for sure. But you can see there's a significant difference. This is now a lot smoother as opposed to how grainy this was. So I'm going to go ahead and let this thing render a whole frame out, and then we're going to come back and see what else we can do to improve it. I'll see you in 2 seconds. So this thing has gone ahead and finished up, and I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with it. We've got some really nice options to play around with in comp. All of our lights are, I think, pretty good. They also emphasize a different aspect to the scene, and they've all come out really nicely, so I'm really happy with that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go off and comp this, but first we need to actually save it out somewhere. So I'm going to right click on this and hit save frame. I'm going to save this to $job, let's pick. I'm just going to call this, I don't know, render 01.exr. Hit save. Second, and there we go, it's written out successfully. Now if you had a sequence, or you had you wanted to just set this off via the mantra ROP, you'd go in here, and just like we did with our texture rendering, we can set this to render, just like we set up, the image out into our pic folder. I've just done it this way just because the render had already happened. I don't want to have to sit through that again. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do a really basic comp of this, and then we'll come back and wrap up. I will see you guys in just a few moments. Alright, so this is the comp that I came up with. You can see I've kind of boosted our lights over here on the left a little bit. I've added some depth haze, and I've kind of toned this light on the right down quite a bit, and then a nice exponential glow just to kind of pop all of those lights. You can see a little bit of comp goes a really long way to making these renders look extra special. Yeah, I hope you got something out of this. This has been, I think we're just over an hour at this point. It's been a fairly fun workshop to run. Please do like and subscribe if you want to see more of this type of stuff, and leave a comment in the comment section below as to any particular subjects you want me to cover. I'd happily go into far more depth, but hopefully this has given you a nice overview of how we go from a completely blank Houdini scene to doing all of the things that we've done, from importing files to generating our own models, building our own materials, and sort of some of the beginnings of learning this great software. If you have any further questions to stuff we did in this tutorial, please feel free to leave a comment down below. I'm happy to do a follow-up if there are enough things that I missed. Hopefully there wasn't anything too major. But yeah, feel free to like and subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you next time for more Houdini stuff. Take care, guys. I'll see you soon.